Perfect. Okay, I'll get started. So thank you, everyone. So 10 years ago, or just over around 10 years ago, I was teaching at a school in Taiwan, and there was a teacher who was setting up her classroom. And as she was setting up her classroom, she had different labels on students' desks that were for different genders. So she had labels for boys and different labels for girls with their name. And I saw some of the ways that this was problematic, that she was reinforcing the idea right when kids in that you are either a boy or a girl. And I tried to challenge her in a number of ways, but nothing was quite clicking. So after, a month, I feel like every week I was giving a little prompt. I was like, would you have labels for your students based off their race? So would you have labels specifically for white people? Would you have labels for Black people, labels for Asian people, labels for mixed race people? And of course she said, no, I cannot do that. That would be racist. So I said, okay, explain how this is not sexist. And finally, I felt like a light bulb clicked. And she was like, oh, I can see how this is a bit problematic. And that started this strategy of juxtaposing practices that reinforce social difference, a sense-making exercise to promote inclusivity. So my name is, Michael Newman. I'm a gender inclusivity advocate and DEIJ leader. I'm currently an elementary assistant principal at Verdala International School in Malta. And I'm really excited to share this practice with you. So gender practices in schools. Schools are a place where teachers constantly have to engage in a variety of gender practices. For instance, I often hear teachers, or I've heard teachers say, good morning, boys and girls, signifying the idea that you're either, a boy or girl. This picture at the left here happened in a very organic way. I was doing a walkthrough in a kindergarten class, and all the boys were playing on one side and all the girls on the other side. And this happened in a very organic way. Now, as an educator, how are you supposed to respond to this? Do you let students kind of play in these gendered environments, or do you disrupt it? How do we kind of navigate these complex practices? Our school, like most libraries, has a variety of books that reinforce and recognize gender in different ways, such as a Smart Girl's Guide to Liking Herself, even on the bad days, or the boys' book of things to make, okay? As educators, how are we supposed to make sense of our books? On the picture to the right here is during our school-wide celebration of Women's History Month. And we do this every year, and we're recognizing women. So gender is a very complex topic, and how are we supposed to navigate this? Now, schools reinforce social differences in a variety of ways. I know in international schools, a big part is our nationality. I have a picture here of during BIPOC month last year, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. The focus is on how we can represent BIPOC people in our learning, and we made sure to kind of recognize and represent people who are BIPOC. Every year our school does a focus on neurodiversity. Last year we were exposing students to people with ADHD. This year we're focusing on those on the autism spectrum. So we're constantly engaging in practices that reinforce difference in a variety of ways. Or here on the picture of the right, we have people celebrating international languages. So as teachers and educators, how are we supposed to recognize and make sense of our practices that reinforce social difference? Okay, so I want you to think of this scenario. Students' gender should be recorded and taken into account when making class lists. Why or why not? I'm going to give you a minute to think about, or not a minute, 10 seconds to think about it. Now we're going to swap. Today we are going to be swapping. We're going to be looking at gender and race. So I want you to think about this situation. Students' race should be recorded and taken into account when making class lists. Why or why not? Now, how does doing this make you maybe think about this practice of how we consider students' identities different? Okay. How are these scenarios similar or different when they're based off gender and race? And that's what we're going to be exploring today. So what is the session about? It's about juxtaposing gender and racial practices. So first, I want to identify what is juxtaposing. It's to place different things, and I want to emphasize that, different things. In no way is this trying to argue that gender and race are the same. I'm saying they are different, but I'm putting them side by side as to compare them or contrast them to create an interesting effect. Okay. At Verdala International School, I've been fortunate to kind of explore this strategy in a variety of ways over the last 7 years. And with my Master's of Education, I really honed into it, and I did a 2-month professional development based off juxtaposing gender and race. And since then, I've been able to kind of spread it in a variety of ways, such as in conferences and at different international schools. And I'm excited to share it with ECIS today. So kind of beginning with the end in mind, By the end of this strategy, by the end of this session, I hope that you have familiarity using this kind of model that we're going to explore, all these different steps of having awareness, swapping, transfer, examining, reflecting, responding. Now, you don't need to read it now, but this is what we're going to be familiarizing self throughout the session. So why juxtapose gender and race? I often find in schools and in our world, we understand gender in a very binary way. So everyone is either a boy and a girl, and there's norms and stereotypes associated with this. Now, I really like this picture here of someone looking at washrooms, and there's one for boys and one for girls, and maybe it feels like they don't really fit into one or the other. Okay. Why juxtapose gender and race? It's about promoting gender inclusivity. And for me, that's recognizing that we live in a world often where we have binary understandings of gender. And it's not to say that boy and girl categories to diminish it, but understanding how they can sometimes put people in boxes and how can we kind of break out of these boxes? How can we make sure that gender is not putting people in very limited ways? And how are we making an inclusive space for those who challenge binary gender norms, specifically members of the LGBTQ plus community? And then why we juxtapose practices that reinforce social difference. The purpose of this is to kind of create a discussion and promote critical reflection on the way that we reinforce social difference. And I'm excited for you to be doing that today. How are we going to learn about it? First, a little introductions. I'm going to introduce myself, and then you're going to have time to work in breakout rooms to kind of talk about your positionality and introduce yourself. And then the big chunk is we're going to be exploring juxtaposing gender and race. I'm going to work you through the protocol or the exercise, and then you're going to have 15 minutes to work on groups where you're going to be looking at some gender practices and juxtaposing them with race. Then I'm going to be sharing some research through my Master's of Education. And last, we're going to kind of have a now what and call to action. So I'll start a bit about my positionality. So positionality is kind of locating yourself and how and where you fit in with this. So on the left here, that's a picture of me as a child. I don't know if I look similar. And as a child, I expressed my gender sometimes in ways that was not typical masculine. I was often made fun of for the way I walked and talked and how I kind of acted like a girl. One example as a child is when I walked, my hips would typically like swing side to side like a female, a girl going down a runway. And my parents, in a well-intentioned way, they saw how I was being made fun of in school, and they would help at home practice me walking, and they'd hold my hips in place so that I would try and walk more like a boy. And they did this, and they're trying to protect me. So this is just one example of how it's kind of a personal thing with me. I identify as a member of the LGBTQ plus community, and the research often indicates that members of the LGBTQ plus community often face higher rates of bullying and harassment because of their gender expression and don't often feel as safe or included in schools. Now, in terms of pronouns, I thought as a gender inclusivity advocate, it's important to share this. But everyone has a different positionality, and for me, it doesn't feel right. I'm an advocate on those sharing their pronouns, for me, I was like, oh, I should put he, him, but that didn't really feel right for me. Then I put he, they, and I was like, that doesn't really feel right for me. So I support other people in sharing their pronouns, but for myself, I don't really feel comfortable in that way. So I think I'm just pointing this out because everyone has quite a different relationship with, gender and race and all sorts of identities. I identify as a Canadian. I would say it's a big part of my identity. I feel like I was raised in a very Canadian way. And that's a big part of, my identity, and I feel my understanding of myself. Now, my heritage is Jewish and German. Now, Jews living in Germany. What I'm pointing this out is my grandparents, their parents faced repercussions living in Germany at the time, and they were both orphans. But when they came to Canada, they considered themselves the Jewish race. They didn't consider, they understood Jewish not as a religion, but as a race for them. Where now I don't think oftentimes many people consider Jewish a race. So I'm pointing this out to kind of point out how it's contextual. Now, in terms of race, I would say identify as white. And as a white man, I understand that I come often from a place of privilege. And I think that's important for me to be specifically anti-racist, is to take a stance to try and kind of disrupt the systems of racism. And I'm understanding that I come from this context, especially juxtaposing gender and race, from a place of privilege, and I have to be really aware of that. So now that I've introduced myself, it's time for you to introduce each other. So you're going to be in breakout rooms around 3 to 4 people for 6 minutes. And first, you're going to introduce yourselves. and discuss how do your different identities and life experiences shape your understanding and beliefs about gender and race. Just some things to keep in mind is be aware of your airtime. There's going to be around 6 minutes, so make sure that everyone has around, anywhere from 2 minutes to a minute and a half, depending on your group size. And some 4 guidelines taken from the Courageous Conversations About Race by Singleton is to stay engaged, right? Experience discomfort. Sometimes it could be a bit uncomfortable reflecting on these areas. Speak your truth. Everyone has a different opinion, perspective that they're bringing forward, and expect and accept non-closure. Not everyone in your group is going to have the same perspective of gender and race. That's it for me. Nancy, do you mind putting them in breakout rooms for 6 minutes?
While I'm organizing the rooms, because I want to make sure I have people from the same school that are in different rooms, please be ready to share. So take a moment, self-reflect on what Michael has asked you to discuss in the group, while I ensure that the rooms have that separation of those from the same school. Most rooms have 3 to 4, but I'm just checking to ensure that we do not have people. I might make a mistake, but I'm hoping that I have not. So this is your time. Like, for example, they're from the same school.
And one thing also to keep, if when you're in breakout rooms, if you could please if you feel comfortable, please put your video on. It's nice, personal way to get to know each other. So I encourage you, if you have it off while in the breakout rooms, to just put it on.
Okay, and I'm just going to move someone, just moved there. Sorry, everyone. I just want to make sure this is correct. And also, please remember your breakout room. You're going to have the same individuals for the second one as well. And I'm just going to move it there. So I think we are okay now. I'm going to stop the recording.
Oh, it's in progress. I can start. So I thought I'd start with the why with juxtaposing and race, now that we've kind of got to know each other a bit better. So as I mentioned before, gender and race, I'm in no way saying they are the same. I'm just trying to draw similarities to the areas in the middle and see how that can challenge the ways that we think about them. So both gender and race are socially constructed groups. What that means is it really depends on social understandings, on different contexts, time, place, etc. For instance, the picture on the right of restrooms that would separate people based off race, we know now, seeing this, that this is socially inappropriate, and you would never, hopefully, never see this anywhere, right? Now we're looking at the picture, the girls and boys washroom. This is normalized in many places and understood as acceptable, but also some places now might not see this as inclusive. I really noticed that when I actually went back to Canada this summer, that most places had to have kind of genders that were not just for binary gender norms. So they're socially constructed groups. Both are often based off physical differences, and there's social hierarchy and discrimination. Both our understandings of gender often came from an idea that men were the more evolved form of the gender. And same with race, there was an understanding that white people are the more evolved form of the human race. So by juxtaposing gender and race, I'm trying to draw really attention to the areas in the middle. Okay. In terms of the literature around gender, there's a couple different areas. One is a gender neutral approach. And this is the idea that teachers should just treat everyone the same, not really emphasize gender. And by doing this, this will lead to gender equality. Now, in contrast to this, there's a gender responsive approach. And this is one that is saying that teachers must specifically recognize gender differences and specific patriarchy and take more of an equity-based approach. So an example would be recognizing that women maybe in learning are not as represented. So teachers finding explicit ways to represent women, such as having a Women's History Month or finding ways like that. Now, another perspective is queer and gender diverse perspectives, often looking at members of the LGBTQ plus community. Now, with this perspective, it's often seen how binary gender norms are often problematic for members of the LGBTQ plus community. And they often emphasize, in a way, taking more of a neutral approach of not really recognizing gender. Now, within the research, it's often seen that the gender neutral approach is not favorable, and that by ignoring gender differences, it often reinforces that. So that's kind of a bit of the context with the literature on gender. Now, in terms of race, there are some similarities. There's a race neutral approach that is often criticized as not actually recognizing racial inequalities. And there is a movement to take race responsive approach. So understanding that we live in a society where there is racism and that there should be an equity-based approach. Now, With the queer gender diverse perspective, there's some similarities with mixed race perspectives. With mixed race perspectives, there often is the idea that some people who are mixed race don't always feel like they belong in one race or the other. So there is some context based off that. So that's some of the ways that they're kind of understood within the literature. Gender and race in research, when they're studied together, they're often understood through an intersectional approach. So this is understanding that the different identities make up different people in different ways and how our identities kind of overlap and are additive. And that's typically when you look at gender and race in the research, how they're understood. So the significance in the research with juxtaposing gender and race, from doing this and reviewing the literature, this for me seems like the first big research that explores this. There's one study that I found in 2002. So a long time ago, context is different, but they looked at how children and adolescents evaluate gender and racial exclusion. Now, again, 2002, a while ago, and what they found in this is that in this research based off a school in the United States was that children typically normalize gender exclusion, where racial exclusion is seen typically as inappropriate. Now, some research have made some general notes kind of about the gender and race kind of juxtaposition like I'm drawing on. One example is in a research on gender bias in preschools. Now, what they found in this is when teachers say it reinforce binary genders in non-stereotypical ways, they would say things like, okay, first the boys line up, second the girls line up, right? Good morning, boys and girls. That typically after a month, students understood gender as opposites. Now, in their discussion, so they did not research this, they said schools should make it unacceptable to use gender-specific language and divisions, example, good morning, boys and girls, as it is to use race-specific language and divisions, example, good morning, Black children and white children. So there are some researchers who've made some reference to the juxtaposition of and like comparing and contrasting gender and race, but typically there hasn't been research that explored if this is an effective strategy to challenge how people think of gender. So now we're going to get into this strategy. So it's juxtaposing practices that reinforce social difference, a sense-making exercise to promote inclusivity. That's what we're going to be going through now. So I thought first, what is sense-making and transfer? Constructing a representation of a context, generating a solution, and evaluating whether the solution makes sense given that context. So that's what we're going to be looking at today is we're understanding gender. We're going to explore some scenarios, and then we're going to be looking comparing it with sense making and transfer with looking at race. So first step in this process is awareness. So I'm going to get you in groups. You're going to have a practice that reinforces social differences and identities and explore different understandings around it. Okay. So an example here, how should teachers use gender to call, address, refer to a group of students? Example saying, good morning, boys and girls, or you girls showed a lot of resilience on your project. Okay. Here's another example, books. What would you do if you stumbled upon books with these titles in your school library, such as Extreme Sports for Boys Only or Smart Women Finish Rich? What are some of your thoughts? What messages does this tell the students? Now, the next step is we swap. So we're going to swap the social identifier with another social identifier, and we're exploring what are our understandings around this new practice. And today we're going to look at gender and race. And I'm picking ones, and I've used race examples that I think will ignite interesting discussion. So for instance, how should teachers use race to call, address, refer to a group of students? Example, saying, good morning, Black and white students, or you Jews showed a lot of resilience on your project, right? And I'm giving this example because I don't know, a couple of years ago when I was a grade 4 teacher, I had like 5 Jewish kids in my students, and they often like to work, Jewish kids in my class. Would I ever say you Jews showed a lot of resilience on your project? I want you to think about that. Or for instance, what would you do if you stumbled upon books with these titles in your library, such as Extreme Sports for Whites Only, or Smart Hispanics Finish Rich? What are some of your thoughts? What messages does this tell our students? Okay. And then after going through these, step 1 is the understanding of gender, step 2 is race, and then you're going to go through the following 3 steps. So you're going to transfer, so compare and contrast the 2 scenarios, identify the similarities and differences. You're examining, analyze potential benefits and problems associated with both practices, and then reflect and respond. Think about how the exercise affected your sense-making about the reinforcement of social differences. Identify steps you can take to foster inclusivity and belonging in your own context. So this is going to be on your slide deck. Give me 1 second. right over here, and it's slide over 3.